So I want to record my electric guitar here in Studio One, and I want to play it through the amp sim which comes with Studio One called Ampire. You can see that here. Now, in order for me to hear this amp sim, I'm going to have to make sure this button is switched on my channel, okay, or on the track that I'm recording. This blue button enables monitoring. That's going to let me hear not only my guitar, but the sound of my guitar after it's being processed by Studio One, and including that amp sim. But right away, even though I've actually got this amp sim bypassed at the moment, I have a problem. Now you're going to hear what I'm hearing when I actually play just one single note. Do you hear that? It's actually two notes. There's the initial note, there's a long delay, and there's another note. That is something called latency, and it's introduced by the fact that it takes time for Studio One, the computer, to process that audio and send it back to our headphones or our monitoring. And that amount of latency or delay would make it almost impossible for me to play this guitar part in time. Okay, it's a real problem. But it's not only with guitar parts, it could happen with vocals, or importantly with virtual instruments as well. I've also got a piano in this particular project. I'll just go over to that, enable its monitoring, or it's already been enabled, and you won't be able to see this quite so clearly, but as I press a note on my piano keyboard, there's quite a delay after I actually press the note. And again, that would make it really impossible for me to actually play that piano part. So many of you, if you're new to recording, may have no idea how to fix this. But even if you've been recording for years, perhaps you come from another DAW, or even you've used Studio One for some years, you may have been fixing this in the traditional way, but that's not the whole story when it comes to Studio One, because it has some amazing features in terms of low latency monitoring, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Hi folks, I'm Mike, and I hope you're well. I must admit I've known about this solution in Studio One for some years, but I hadn't fully appreciated how to implement it. Then recently my tiny little brain had an aha moment, and I thought, so that's how you're supposed to use it. It's super effective and really important, and that's why I'm sharing it with you guys. Now, I'm actually going to start off by showing you the usual method for fixing latency, whether it's in Studio One or some other DAW. And the reason we're doing that is because it is actually part of the entire solution, which I'm going to show you. So we're going to start off by pressing Control comma or Command comma if you're on Mac on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up options. And I want you to make sure you go over to the audio setup tab at the top here, and then within that make sure you're on the audio device tab. Now there's a couple of really important numbers here. The first one at the top here is the device block size. It's showing 1024 samples at the moment, and we need to get that number lower. Basically, the higher this number, the longer the computer takes to process all the audio, and that's why we get that delay or latency. The other numbers I want you to take note of are the input and output latency at the bottom here. At the moment, they're both showing around about 21 milliseconds for me, and that's too long. We need to get that number down. A target for this would be around about 10 milliseconds or less, and I must admit, I prefer it to be around about 7, but less than 10 is workable normally. And the way we're going to get that down is by adjusting that first number, the device block size. Now, for some of you, depending on your audio interface, you may actually be able to click here. You'll get a drop down menu and you can just select a lower value there. But for other people like me, we actually need to go over to this control panel button, and that's going to bring up the control panel for our device, for our audio interface. So this is going to be different depending on what audio interface you have. I've got an Antelope Audio one, so mine looks like this. Yours will look different, but you're looking for this kind of setting, buffer size, okay? That's what we want to adjust. Mine is at 1024 at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and change it. And I'll tell you what, why not just go for the lowest possible value here? Let's go for 8, okay? So I'll click on 8, I'll click on Apply, and when we go back over to the control panel, you can see it now says 8 samples. And look at that latency. It's now down to less than, it's down to 0.27 milliseconds, okay, which is actually way lower than we need it to be. But you may think, hey, that's a good thing, right? If I play my guitar now, fine, there doesn't appear to be any latency. So let's close this and go back to the project. Now what I'm going to do is actually, I'm not going to record anything yet, but I'm just going to play back a section of my project. And what we're going to hear is some pops and crackles and things like that. Have a listen. Did you hear that? If you didn't hear it, just rewind a little bit and have a listen again. It almost sounds like the sort of crackles that you would get on an old vinyl record or something like that. And we don't want that, obviously, in our playback. So normally what we have to do is go back to our options again. So I'll press Control, comma, and sort of get a compromise, where we've got 8 samples at the moment. We'll just put it up to a higher number, so we've got a low enough latency, but so the playback still works okay. Now you'll have to experiment with this. It's going to be different on different systems. I happen to know for me that it's around about 128, okay? So I'll bring up my control panel again, and I'm going to change this to 128 and apply it. So over here it's changed to 128, and you can see it's showing around about a 2.7 millisecond latency there at the moment. So that's fine, that should be fine. I'll click on OK, my guitar feels all right. Yeah, and then if I do some playback, not getting any sort of artifacts or crackles or anything. Now this is going to be different depending on the project. This is a relatively small project. If I had like 70 or 100 tracks with lots of plugins, I'd probably still be getting some crackling there, and I'd have to adjust that again, okay, to come up with that sort of balancing number. Now at the moment, I actually already switched off a couple of plugins in my master bus. If I go over there, I'm going to switch them back on. There's one from IK Multimedia, another one from Isotope here, okay. I was sort of trying to create a better solution or a better scenario so that we could get it to a low enough number. Now that I've switched them back on, let's have a listen to my guitar. So now the latency is back again, and I'm afraid to say that even if I go to my options and have a look, that number hasn't changed, but we can definitely hear it here, and I don't think that's a workable latency. The problem is if I try and reduce this block size further than 128, we're probably going to start to introduce some crackles again. So it really is a balancing act. So what a lot of people do is try and get that down to a low enough number, perhaps switch off some plugins and things, and then they end up doing what I'm going to call the buffer size shuffle, okay? It's not a dance, it's just something we end up doing indoors, because later in the project when we're mixing and we've got loads and loads of plugins and lots of tracks in there, and we're not recording anymore, so we don't care about latency, we'll probably end up going in and changing that buffer or that block size to a much bigger number so that we can cope with actually mixing. And that's the sort of a shuffle we end up having to do. But because of some of the features in Studio One that, like me, you either ignored or don't know how to use, we haven't realized that that's actually quite unnecessary. Let's take a look. So this is when I had my aha kind of light bulb moment. It's when I realized the significance of these 2 tabs in options, the audio device tab, which we've been using up until now, and the one next to it, which is called processing. Now I want you to think of these 2 tabs in this way, and then you'll really be able to use this effectively. I want you to think of this first tab, audio device, as where we set up the settings for latency for the thing we're recording. Think about this as the kind of recording tab, okay? And of course here we want to set the values as low as possible so that we don't get that latency or delay. Now I want you to think of the second tab next to it, the processing tab, as the playback tab. Our needs are different here for the playback of the backing music, We actually want the buffer size to be big, so that it can cope with everything it's processing. And we can actually change it to a different value there. If we go over to the processing tab, yeah, at the moment we can see, when we've got this set to minimum at the moment, we can see that it's got 128 samples, the same as our first tab, 128 samples. But when we go to that processing tab, again, we want to think about this as being the tab for playback. We can change this independently, and we do that with this drop down menu. If we look at this and click on it, you can see we've got values between minimum and maximum here. Okay, let's just go for the maximum value. I'm going to click on maximum. You may not need to do this depending on your setup. Now it's reporting a block size of 2048 samples. Let's go back to the other tab. Over there it's 128 samples. So we're fulfilling the needs of both parts of what we're trying to do here, recording and playback. Okay, now if I click on OK to close this now and play my guitar, I've still got latency. There's just one more thing that we have to do. I'm going to go over to my master bus over here, and right at the bottom I can see this kind of Z or Z symbol depending on which part of the world you're from. We've got to make sure that that is switched on. It's going to turn green when it's switched on. Just as a by the way, if you've got some other outputs here set up for things like, say, headphones or what have you, you need to make sure it's switched on for all of those as well. Now I'm going to play my guitar. No latency. Okay, let's go ahead and switch on my amp sim so I'm getting the sound I want. I'm just going to go ahead and record the guitar part. Let's see what the latency is like, and let's see if there's any pops and crackles in the playback. Seems absolutely fine, and it feels wonderful. It feels responsive. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay, so how about my piano, virtual instruments? I'm going to switch over to my piano in Studio One. It's armed for recording as well as my guitar, in fact, and I've got that monitoring switched on. But let's see what happens when I press a note on my piano keyboard. We've still got that latency. What we need to do is make sure, if we go into options, again, pressing Control, comma, and on that processing tab there, just make sure we've got this checkbox checked. It's enable the latency or low level monitoring for instruments. I'll click on OK and let me play my piano. Perfectly responsive. What a wonderful solution. Now, to be honest with you, once you've done that, you've really no need to keep jumping into options for different scenarios. This is going to still work well for mixing. There's one slight issue that you may have. Some people report that sort of, when they're in this sort of mode with the Z switched on or the Z switched on, that some things in the UI may have a little bit of latency. Definitely when you start playback, there'll be a little bit of pause. And some people say like the metering and things like that is not as responsive, but that's fine. Once you're mixing, the only thing you need to do if you get that problem is just go over and flick that Z off there. Okay. So no need to do the buffer size shuffle anymore. Just make use of the little green Z. Of course, it's not just Ampire that you may want to be using as a plugin. It could be any one of the wonderful stock plugins that come with Studio One. I've got an ever-growing playlist of tutorials about those stock plugins. You can take a look at that right here. I'm going to get back to playing this wonderful Gretsch.